Welcome to the TCJ podcast, where we discuss curious, thought-provoking, and sometimes controversial ideas through the lens of biblical wisdom. I'm your host, Keith Wood. Today, my guest is Dr. Kyle Tadlock. Dr. Tadlock is the professor of history here at TCJ, and he's also the chair of the Department of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Tadlock, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It is my pleasure. In theological context and in apologetic context, a topic that comes up frequently is all the talk about slaves and slavery in the Bible. On the apologetic side, people want to know, like, how could God have said some of the things that he says about slaves or about slavery? And then theologically, Christians are even called slaves of God. And so we kind of have an interest in knowing, like, what's going on there. And sometimes, in my own personal experience anyway, people will sort of gesture toward differences between slavery as we think of it as Americans and slavery in the ancient world. But I have to admit that I've never been entirely clear on exactly how those two kind of realms of slavery differ. And so I was hoping that you could help paint a more vivid picture for me today, particularly of ancient slavery. So to start off with, when historians talk about slavery in the ancient world, what do they mean by that? And what would an ancient person understand by the term slavery?
So slavery, no matter what the context, is always defined by a lack of freedom. You do not have the freedom to do what you want, to live where you want. Somebody is telling you what to do. And of course, there's the occupational aspect of it, where you are working for somebody else more or less for free. Now, there are exceptions to that, and we can talk about that a little bit later. So generally, again, particularly to the Greeks, there's free and there's unfree, and that's where the distinction lies. The slave is unfree.
Okay, so minimally there's going to be a lack of freedom involved there.
Correct.
All right. Well, what would be some of the biggest misconceptions that people bring to conversations about ancient slavery, particularly people in our context today?
So ancient slavery was not about race at all. And so generally speaking, you find two broad groups of slaves. You've got debt slaves, who are people who are sold into slavery to pay off a debt, either their own, perhaps their families, and then prisoners of war. There are some others. There was an international slave trade going on, but for the most part, it's either your own people in debt bondage or foreigners as prisoners of war.
Okay. So it sounds like then it wasn't necessarily something about classifying a group of people as like inferior or something. It's just like they're, for lack of a better word, pragmatic reasons why these people end up being enslaved.
So the Greeks had an interesting idea. They argued that slaves were unmanly, they were feminine or not masculine, precisely because they were slaves. And you see this a lot when you have these few occasions where the Greeks are like, hey, things are really bad, maybe we should arm our slaves. And of course, a lot of times the answer was no, because if they were any good at war, then they wouldn't have been slaves. They wouldn't have gotten caught, or they would have fought to the end. And so it becomes a sort of circular reasoning about why slaves should not be used for war.
Okay. It almost sounds like a witch trial thing. Like, oh, well, I guess it wasn't a witch, or, they burned alive. Okay. Are you able to say a word about how these ancient slave systems originated? Were they primarily the result of warfare or of economics or
So what's
something
interesting
else?
is we actually don't know where slavery originated. So you've got these ancient law codes. You've got Hammurabi's famous law code. You've got the earlier law code of Urnamu from the Third Dynasty. And slaves are they're there. And so they're a distinct class of people. Generally speaking, they don't have the same protections as others. And so famously, in Hammurabi's code, slaves get much worse treatment than any level of free people. But again, there's no explanation either of those of where do they come from. And so some of what I read seems to say that the ancient Near East, it was more debt slavery. So again, the idea is you racked up a debt, and so you might sell yourself into slavery, or the person who owe money might sell you and then use that money to recoup some of that's lost.
Wow, that is so interesting, and it's like hard to fathom, actually. So slavery just kind of started popping up in terms of the historical record. And
well, yes, I mean, prisoners of war also kind of makes sense, because again, you've captured these people, they're good for labor, and so why would you not put them to work?
Yeah, I mean, I can see how it would develop. It's so fascinating that no one was like, there was no distinct point in time that we can point to where it's like slavery, started here.
And so it's probably just one of those things that happened before people started writing things down.
Yeah.
Or it was so commonplace already by the time writing was invented. It's like, yep, they're here. Everybody knows about slaves.
Okay. Wow. Was slavery, was it a predictable consequence of war through much of ancient history? Like, was this something where armies were going on and intentionally trying to get slaves as like a reason for going to war?
So determining motives for war is difficult, but I mean, slaves are just considered part of the plunder. So generally, the way this works, you take a foreign city. You generally probably going to kill all the military age men just because they're going to be a problem for you. Then you'll take the women, boys, and young girls into slavery. Now, there are some exceptions because obviously a man who's military age is also your best source of labor. But obviously, again, you don't want somebody who's too fierce to be a slave because then it's terrible quality for a slave to be aggressive.
So if we can kind of drill into the life of a slave a little bit, or, it's particularly one of these slaves taken in war. How would a person's life typically change, or how might a person's life change between that moment of capture and war and the actual like final sale into slavery? What did that process look like?
It's going to depend on many circumstances. So in the ancient world, a lot of times you had slave traders just following armies around. And so, again, I would use the Greeks because I know a little bit about how they distribute plunder. All right, so generally, the general in charge got to pick how plunder was distributed. So they might say, okay, the bravest men get the pick of the litter. And that goes all the way back to Homer. And then he'll distribute it down. And so part of that might be, all right, you fought well, you get X number of slaves. All right, then the soldier has to decide, okay, if this slave is mine, he's now my responsibility. Do I want to keep him alive for the rest of the campaign, or do I want to sell him off now and just take the money? And so, again, let's just say that you're sold. Then you're going to be taken to a population center, and you're going to be sold. Again, I'm not quite familiar if they did auctions or not, but obviously the fitter slaves are going to be worth more money. You're looking for generally a strong slave for the farm or something like that, and then your fate from there is going to vary quite widely depending on what it is you're being bought for.
And that was actually my next question for you, was what are the primary like uses that people are having for slaves?
So that's going to depend. I know I say that a lot, but again, in the ancient Near East, there's massive buildings projects and there's always agricultural work. So you're probably going to wind up doing one or more of those. When you get to ancient Greece, particularly ancient Athens, so if you are a male slave and you're bought by a middle-class person, that is someone who owns enough land to support himself, you're going to be working beside the man of the house as a field slave. And so what's interesting about Greek slavery is, generally speaking, you do the same thing your master does. In theory, the average Athenian farmer, he wants at least one slave. So one person estimates maybe as many as 3 to help spread the work. His wife would also want a house slave to help deliver her from some of the household drudgery. And so that life, again, you're unfree, but you're not doing anything more difficult than anyone else is. On the other hand, you've got big slave owners, like we know the Order Lysias. He had a shield factory. He employed 100 slaves. So that would be, we probably call it industry today. And that would be skilled or even semi-skilled labor. So these aren't field hands. They know how to make a shield.
Wow.
If you're really unfortunate, you got sent to the silver mines at Larium, or you got sent to a salt mine. And that's the backbreaking work that free people just did not want to do.
Yeah, but for me, that's really interesting to hear, because when I think of slavery, my conception of slavery normally is backbreaking work that free people don't want to do, right? And I mean, even in America, I know that we did have like house slaves and stuff, but the idea of them doing, that kind of skilled work sounds like very different. And I don't even know, I'm so I guess, illiterate historically that I don't even know if my picture of slavery is accurate where American slavery is concerned, but that is the picture that I have.
So when you get to the Roman era, things are a little bit different. So the Romans have what we could argue is a slave society. In other words, one built on slavery. Why? Because they had a lot more victories in war. And so particularly when you get to the late Republic, you have what are called latifundia. And so what would happen is as the fighting middle class began to decline in the late Republic, senators would buy up a bunch of farms, put them together, and create an estate. Well, Romans don't really want to work for each other. There's a whole ethos thing there. And so they would then fill it up with slaves. And so this is probably more like antebellum South slavery than anything else we're going to find in the ancient world. Because you're going to have the overseers, you're going to have an absentee landlord because he's going to be off in Rome, only visiting his estates when he feels like it. And most of the production there is going to be done by slaves. But even then, you had urban slaves, so they would be craftspeople. Greek slaves were popular once Rome conquered Greece, because a lot of them, they would be teachers, or they would even they would read things. A lot of Romans couldn't even read before a certain point. And so the job of the slave would actually be to read to their master. Going back to
that I'm sorry, but that is just such a wild thing to hear. The idea that, I can't read, so let me go ahead and get a slave to read to me is so very different from the kind of slavery that I envision.
So literacy in the ancient world is a funny thing. Generally speaking, you had, especially in the Near East, you had scribes. And your average king probably couldn't read or write either, because why is he king? Because he's good in battle. And, now, eventually, the Romans are going to learn Greek. Of course, Latin is going to become a literary language, etc. But yeah, there's a lot of even Romans who are minded as children by slaves and are taught by slaves. There's even, same thing in Athens. A lot of times, children would be led around by a slave. And that was his sole job, was to sort of shepherd children from place to place. And obviously, that slave is well trusted because you're giving him your children.
Yeah. Let's talk about the social status of these slaves. And I would imagine that, like pretty much everything we've talked about, it varies depending on the particular location. But yeah, how would the typical enslaved person have been seen socially, and what kind of legal rights, if any, did they have?
So depends. But I mean, one thing that doesn't change is slaves are pretty much always going to be at the bottom of the social ladder. In fact, and this is true of the ancient world as well as the antebellum South, slavery allowed the Greeks and Romans to say, hey, you might be poor and you might not have a good life, but at least you're free, unlike this person. So one of the things that slavery can do is sort of give what's called an other within. Someone to point at and say, at least you're not that. You're better than that. We're all unified by this. And again, same sort of thing happened in the South before the Civil War. Now, what exactly rights do you have? That depends. So in ancient Greece, you were actually not allowed to kill your own slave. Now, obviously, if you did, if it was an accident, well, somebody had to bring you up on charges because there was no state prosecutors in ancient Greece. And so then the question is, does anybody care enough to do anything about that? If you're talking about Sparta, which is sort of a different thing, you've got the Helots. These were actually fellow Greeks that they had enslaved during a war and used as their laborers. They were state-owned. So you got slaves with the land, so in that sense they're serfs, but you could not just kill them. In fact, there's a whole lot of things you couldn't do because you didn't own them. The state did. Now, once again, if you thought your helot was up to something bad and you murdered him, well, that's too bad, and congratulations for saving the state some trouble later.
Gotcha. Okay. So, like, on paper, they've got rights. In practice, we'll see.
Well, yeah. Again, the question is, does anybody care enough to step up to them?
Yeah.
And generally, even if there was a case, a lot of times it's not that the person necessarily cares about the slave. It's a way to get back at the owner. Because Athenian courts it's politics by other means.
Gotcha. What about family life for enslaved people? Were they able to marry, raise children, or I guess own property too?
We'll talk about Roman examples. We know a lot more. So we have slave families. Now, of course, obviously, if you wanted to get married, you had to get the owner's permission. And a lot of times what would happen is when a Roman slave was free, and this happened pretty often. There's a whole social thing about manumission, about setting them free. Yeah, you could have your own families. And what's interesting about Roman law is that a freedman had some legal rights. And their children could actually be full Roman citizens. Now, there was some strictures put on that. Like, you very rarely, you wouldn't like immediately be able to run for office or anything. And in fact, Augustus said, hey, freedmen and their children cannot run for senatorial class. But yeah, you'll see them moving up, especially under the emperors, because freedmen have like really no political will of their own. So you can give them power without worrying about it having to create a potential rival. And so particularly as the Julio-Claudians fade into the Flavians, you've got more and more freedmen taking up positions in the imperial bureaucracy.
Yeah, I guess it would be easy to make a friend in that regard, right?
Yes.
It's pretty, you know what they want, and it's pretty easy to provide it to them if you've got the power. Is that kind of the idea?
Yes. Also, when a Roman slave was liberated, they generally took the last name, for lack of a better word, of their former owner. And so in that sense, they were adopted into the master's family.
So this process of being freed, it sounds like it was fairly common. Is that right?
It is. In fact, the longer the Roman Empire existed, the more common it became.
Okay.
And there's some gain as well, because a lot of times in the contract, you might owe your former master a certain amount of money. And of course, he is essentially your paterfamilias. So he's kind of the head of your household as well. And so there's good reasons for that. And sometimes you might even say, all right, we'll set you free, but you still owe me, again, X amount of your income, particularly if you are a craft slave.
What would be some of them? I mean, you've already kind of said how many people were freed, but are there any other like pathways to freedom in the ancient world?
Buying your freedom, and again, generally you're only going to see this among skilled slaves. So your owner would say, okay, you're going to work with me as a stonemason because that you already have that skill, and I'll allow you to keep half your wages. And then that's an agreement you can make, and then you'd be set free. Running away is an option, although obviously there are a lot of dangers there if people realize you're a slave. And I said there's not a racial component to slavery in ancient Greece, but then again, if you see a Thracian running around Greece, probably not there as a free person. It's probably going to be a slave.
How does a slave get into the, you mentioned that the people who are skilled slaves are the ones who are more likely to make money and stuff. So it seems like they've got some bargaining power in this situation. Would the idea be like, hey, I've got these skills, and if you want me to put my skills to work for you, we're going to have to wheel and deal? Like, where does their bargaining power come from in that relationship?
I mean, all the power rests with the slave owner. Because you don't, yes, you are a skilled stonemason, but I don't need one. I need someone to tend the cattle. So congratulations, you're now a shepherd. Now, obviously, I think the business decision would probably come at the beginning. So you have a stonemason saying, all right, I have more work than I can do. It'd be nice if I could have a slave to help me. So then you go find one.
Okay. I guess I'm just not understanding how they're going to say, okay, you have the ability to be a stonemason. I'm going to make you my slave. At what point do they say, like, and I'll give you half of my, is this just out of the goodness of their heart? They're choosing to give half of the profits
away?
Again,
it's one of those things that happens, and we only know about it after the slave is free.
Yeah, fair enough. That is just like an interesting, as I think about American slavery, it's very difficult to imagine a situation where the plantation owner would say, like, hey, I'll go ahead and do some profit sharing with you or something. I don't know, maybe it happened and I just don't know about it, but that's not the picture that I have of slavery.
Another way is, again, participation in war. So again, Greeks especially do not want to use their slaves for war, but sometimes you've got no better options. So again, going back to ancient Athens, because that's where I'm most knowledgeable about, you guys, especially when you look at the Athenian fleet, you've got a lot of ships and you need over 100 rowers for each. And so we have evidence of slave rowers. And generally, being a rower was a paid position. And so these slave owners were like, hey, you can use my slave on the ships. Now, obviously, they got the money, not the slave, unless, again, something had been arranged. So there's that. And then, of course, if you're fighting on land, well, there's only so much you can offer a slave. And sometimes things got bad enough where it's like, okay, if you agree to fight for the city, you'll get your freedom. Of course, again, this is something that's done only under great duress because you can only offer to free a slave once. And then, of course, there's the whole idea that, well, even if you did free a slave, well, the fact they're a slave means they can't fight, so I don't know how much good it's going to do. And on the few times that we know that happened, it seemed like at least once the city made good on it, and there's another time where they're like, well, yeah, we said that, but no, we're not.
Yikes. Okay.
I mean, what are you going to do?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you definitely got to manage that, I guess. Okay. I just had a follow-up question, and now I'm trying to remember what it was. Oh, what is, generally speaking, what would the value of a slave have been?
So they were on really sort of shaky ground. But let me give you some of the best guess that I saw when I was looking up things. We're not really sure how much things cost, particularly in ancient Athens. So one guess is that a slave was about 200 drachma. What is that in modern terms? Couldn't tell you.
Okay.
It is a fairly significant layout, but not coincidentally, it seems to be the same amount as buying the full panoply you would need to fight as a hoplite. And so basically, one slave is equivalent to one good suit of armor, which is really interesting because when you went out to war as a hoplite, you didn't want to carry your own gear. You had a slave do it for you. And so again, the idea is, you already you've worked up, you've got those 2-3 slaves. One of them is going to come with you to war and carry your gear.
Okay. So, I mean, they were valuable. It's not like you could just lose a slave and go buy another one the next day unless you were
right.
Pretty
now,
substantial.
Obviously, if you're someone like Lysias who's got 100 of them working for you, that is considerable capital investment.
Yeah.
Again, in the Roman Republic and Empire, that changes a lot. Just if you had any recent conquest, the price of slaves goes down significantly. If it's been a while, then they're going to go up.
When we think about these different societies and their perspective of slavery, did they view slavery as a natural part of human life? Was it viewed as more of an economic necessity or divine judgment upon these people?
I mean, generally, they didn't really think about it much at all. It was.
Okay.
And one of the things that I challenge my students to think about is, we think today of slavery as being a terrible evil, but that's a really, very, very new idea. For most world history, it's like, yeah, some people are going to end up slaves. That's just the way it's going to be. Again, from time immemorial, we've had slaves.
Were there any critiques that we know of? Maybe fringe ones, but they were still kind of there?
I mean, the early Christianity, obviously that had a big impact on it. Just the idea, because it doesn't go very far from, hey, this person is your brother in Christ. We're all equal to, well, then what are we doing here? Why do we have slaves? Again, most of the ancient philosophers I can think of, it's like, yeah, there's some people who are just fit for servitude.
Right.
Again,
the natural slave idea, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so by and large, it wasn't really something that was challenged.
No.
When Christians came onto the scene and had this idea that we're all created equal, even my brother in Christ can be a slave, or vice, even a slave can be my brother in Christ, I should say. What kind of impact did that ideology have on the world that they inhabited?
So that is actually a really big historiographical debate, because when that is happening, we're also seeing sort of the decline of the Roman Empire. And so you've not really had any good, I don't want to say good, any wars to bring in a lot of slaves. So by the time you get to Christianity becoming a force, I mean, Trajans invade Dacia, but Dacians are fierce. They make terrible slaves. So you don't have a lot of opportunity. Of course, slaves have children. But yeah, so slavery, some would argue, was already in decline, and Christianity didn't necessarily do much for it. Others have a much rosier view and say, no, it was Christianity making these arguments. And so it's really an historiographical issue, what the role of Christianity was in the decline of slavery in the Roman world.
Yeah, there's these two things that both seem to have a little bit of explanatory power, and how you weigh one or the other is a matter of some debate. That makes sense. Did ancient people, I mean, it kind of sounds like you've answered this already, but I'll just ask, did ancient people distinguish between like good and bad forms of slavery, or maybe better or worse forms of slavery?
I would say not. Well, yes. So the Greeks had this idea that there were, all right. So the absolute worst are slaves, doulos, those, and then you've got these weird class like the helots. There's their equivalent, I think, in Argos, the Penites, and we're not that they were. The big thing is they were actually Greek. So that seems to be the thing. There were Greeks who were somehow enslaved to other Greeks. So that they're not quite slaves because hey, they're at least Greek. But on the other hand, they're not free, so therefore they're not fully Greek, if that makes sense. This whole idea about freedom and working for yourself. As far as degrees, generally it's just what is it that you do? Because everyone recognized that obviously your mine slaves, they've got it the worst. Your field slaves, again, it's a lot of hard work, but it's nothing that you wouldn't ask someone else to do. And then, of course, you've got your house slaves, many of whom have skills. And of course, at the very least, you get to work inside all day. Again, same in the Roman world. Your latifundia slaves, they have it really rough. And obviously, your craftsman slaves, they get a certain amount of freedom.
So, I mean, it's no different from how we might classify occupations as better or worse today,
Correct.
right? You've got a cushy job, or you've got a really backbreaking job, or something like that. Okay. How would enslaved people in the society, if they want to sort of resist or express agency through rebellion, would rebellion be a common way that they would do that, or trying to escape? Would they, try to save up money? Like, how did they express their agency as slaves?
So there we're going to run into a problem of evidence because not a lot of Greeks or Romans either really cared about slaves until they did something terrible.
Okay.
So what resistance looks like is going to depend on how many there are. So in ancient Greece, we don't generally see slave revolts just because, again, there's one or two of you on a farm and there's one or two on another farm. And so you don't have these giant concentrations of slaves. And since Greek slaves came from various places, they tend a lot of times you wouldn't even be able to form an revolt because you probably can't even speak the same language. So again, Thracian slaves are constantly mentioned in the literature. Well, Thracians are very tribal, and a lot of times the one person they might hate more than the people enslaving them is a Thracian from another tribe, and so there we see a chance to run away. Now, when given the opportunity, they'll do it. There's this famous example that at the end of the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans actually build a permanent fort in Attica at Decelea. And one of the things they do is they say, hey, if you are a slave, if you come to us, we'll free you, because they're trying to sort of break the back of the Athenian economy. Well, according to Thucydides, about 20,000 slaves took them up on that. 2 myriad is how he describes it. And we've been arguing for a long time over what does that even mean? Like, is that a number he picked out of a hat just to say a lot? Were there actually 20,000 slaves in Attica to begin with? And so the idea is no matter what you think of the number itself, the idea is that there were a lot of slaves and they would certainly take the opportunity to be free if that presented itself. So that's the Greek example. The exception is, again, the Helots, because what Sparta has done is they've taken an entire Greek people and enslaved them on their own land. And of course, they are very prone to revolt. In fact, one of the reasons why, actually the reason why Sparta becomes such a famed militaristic society is this constant fear of slave revolt. And so there, you got to keep them down. So the Spartan army always has to have some of its members back in Greece. You've got this idea, the Cryptia, the secret war. So every year, the Spartans would declare ceremonial war on the Helots. And then they would send out the best and brightest of their 18, 19-year-olds just to sort of travel the countryside, look for any Helot that was good-looking, brave, seemed to be a leader, and just murder them. And it was okay, because that's the whole point of declaring war, is that, well, we haven't sinned against the gods, because this is an act of war. And so that was one way of keeping that from happening. Now, eventually, when the Helots do revolt, it's a big deal. In the Roman Empire, you've got, of course, the famous Spartacus revolt. You've got all kinds of revolts of slaves, because what the Romans are doing is they're taking large numbers of slaves from the same place and putting them in the same place to work. And so they can speak the same language. They can realize how bad their life is. And so that's when you start getting these big slave revolts.
You mentioned earlier how race wasn't really the main thing. The ways that people conceived of race back then was a lot different than it was today. Would an ancient Roman or Greek, would they have even understood race as we talk about it? I know you said that's not really the main thing, but how would they have even thought about our concept of race?
So they were very fascinated by ethnography. In fact, Herodotus, the historian, actually was trained in ethnography before he became an historian. And if you ever read the histories, you'll notice like he is fascinated by what is it that makes the Egyptians a different kind of people? What is their culture? What is their beliefs? And then he does the same thing, the Persians and literally everyone he meets. That's why the history is just so long.
Okay.
So they understood that different societies were different. Now, were they racist in the sense we would mean it? No, they just thought that everyone else they met was inferior to being Greeks. Obviously, the best people were the Greeks. And to be fair, that's a cultural chauvinism that's found everywhere. Egyptians thought the same thing. They thought they were the only real people on Earth, and that's something that happened. Again, it's not uncommon.
Yeah, so everybody basically thought that they were the best.
Correct.
We're aware of these differences, but it's, I know that a lot of what happened in America would have been driven by, in some cases, evolutionary views and things like that. Depending on what time frame you're looking at, right? But that doesn't sound like that's what was going on there. They're not really trying to give some explanatory account of why these people are inferior or something. It's just like, well, they're not us.
Right, they're not us. They were unable to preserve their own freedom, therefore they deserve slavery.
Okay, all right, yeah. Well, it's a pretty simple view, I guess, but it
works.
Yeah, it works in a sense. When someone, kind of shifting gears a little bit and, thinking more along Christian lines, when someone reads the Bible's references to slavery, what are some historical realities that you think they should keep in mind as they do that?
That slavery just was a part of the world. Like, didn't necessarily mean anything to them. And of course, we assume from our own culture history that slaves were always treated poorly. And sometimes they were. Like, there's no getting around that. Again, going slightly off topic, but for instance, in ancient Athens, a slave was not allowed to testify in court until they were tortured. Because the idea was that, they would lie to defend their masters unless you tortured the truth out of them. Whereas a free person could not be tortured. And so these things happen. But on the other hand, a slave is an investment. And so there's a balance there.
When you think about something like the book of Philemon, right? Paul writes to Philemon and sends this message with the slave Onesimus. And, he tells Onesimus to go back to him and everything like that. I think a lot of people read that and they're like, how can this be, right? How could you be telling a slave to go back and serve their master, their owner, or whatever? To what extent would it be a fair analogy to kind of picture that in American terms? Like would Paul have said the same thing? I'm asking you for a little bit of speculation here. Would he have said the same thing to maybe a slave from Mississippi who's made it up north, right? If someone's thinking of it as that sort of thing, are they thinking about it in the wrong way, or is that largely the same sort of situation in your opinion?
I don't think so, because again, what is the thing connecting Onesimus to Philemon? It's the fact they're brothers in Christ. And again, Southern slave owners, they would have all kinds of religious justifications for why slavery is right. I would say that Paul probably wouldn't, because, more than likely, that slave is being very poorly treated. And we don't necessarily have any evidence that Philemon's being mistreated. He is a slave. He has no freedom. And so I think all other things being equal, I would say probably not.
Okay, yeah, so that's a really interesting point, that there was kind of a religious framework that people were using in the American, in many cases, they were trying to justify it within their religion. And you don't have that same kind of background, I guess, for like a Roman Christian. They're not coming to it and saying like, let me justify these. It's kind of like we've just been doing life and now we're Christians and we're trying to figure this whole thing out. Is that kind of the picture?
Yeah, because again, I mean, theoretically, Roman has the power of life and death. So Onesimus could have just been like, no, I'm going to execute you. But Paul is saying, let's redefine that relationship and treat you as actual brothers. And so it, and again, there's also, even in normal Roman slavery, there is sort of that idea of being part of the family. Because again, a slave was a part of the household. And I think that's another difference. Is again, in the American South, it's like, here is the big house. This is where I live. You guys are over here in the slave quarters, and you just do the work I send you to do. And I don't even think we have that. Now, again, you read Southern slave owners, they'll talk about paternal, how they're their children. But I feel, if nothing else, and sometimes the reality of Roman slavery is probably a little more that than in the South.
Yeah. You know, you have given me a lot of information. There's been a lot of twists in this conversation that I was not expecting, and so I thank you for bringing all this information. I think that that's going to be about it for us today. But thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed this. I feel like I'll probably listen to this a couple times and just like try to remember some of the things we've talked about. But I hope the people at home have enjoyed following along and have learned something here. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you.
And to those of you who have joined in, we hope you enjoyed it, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.